Happy snow day, ladies. We're going to continue on in our day one notes by looking at the first of the systems that we are interested in, which is the skeletal system. And so these notes are going to quickly run you through the major bones of the body, and then we'll continue on with this next class, looking into radiology and how scans can show us these bones in a living person. So to start out, we always want to look at what the major function of a system is. In other words, this is sort of the physiology part that goes with the anatomy. So what does that organ or that organ system actually do? And your skeletal system is actually extremely important. It's the framework that you are built upon. So probably the number one function here is just support. It's how you stand. It's what your muscles work against. So it's a supportive framework. Second thing is protection. Think about that for a second. I mean, you essentially have a skull to protect your brain. You have a rib cage to protect your heart and lungs. And so a lot of times we're forming a protective barrier with our bones as well. Like I said a moment ago, your muscles work against your bones. So movement is also a key function of the skeletal system. People don't think of this often, but really a muscle has to be able to generate force against something, right? It has to be able to pull or push something, and that something is your bones. Now, we also have a couple of other functions that are extremely important, but a little bit different in nature, and that is that the bones are a storage facility, basically, for fats and different minerals inside that bone matrix. And also the bone marrow inside of many of your bones is where we form new blood cells, both red blood cells and white blood cells for your immune system. Now this awesome picture is an example of protecting yourself with helmets, right? This is probably the only time I've worn a helmet, I think, since I was a little kid. But this was on our honeymoon when we got to do a Segway tour of Epcot at Disney World, which was just absolutely awesome. If you ever want to get me off track in class, bring up Segways, because I think Segways are really, really cool. And one day when I make a huge scientific discovery and have lots and lots of money, I'm just going to buy a whole bunch of Segways to drive around everywhere I go. Okay, so some basic terms that we use in the skeletal system first. It's almost frightening how many different terms there are. You probably never realized before, and this is why I have this picture of the underside of the skull over here. How many intricacies your skeletal system might have. So in our class, you're just going to have to know what a bone is. Like, this is the femur, or this is the humerus. If you go to medical school, you have to learn different characteristics of every bone. And so as you can see numbered on this skull, there are really about 30 different tiny openings on the underside of the skull. And you have to know the name and location of every single one of them if you're going to be a doctor or a dentist or one of those other professionals. Don't worry, we're not going to that level of detail here. Terms, though. First one is foramen. A foramen is a hole in a bone. So if there's an opening in the bone, like you see right here, this really big one, that's called a foramen, or the plural of this is foramina. A fossa is a dip in a bone. So if the bone kind of dips inward, you can kind of see there's sort of a dip here in this picture, this lower picture. If there's sort of a valley in the bone, but not a hole all the way through it, we call that a fossa. Then you have the term articulation, which you've maybe heard before, which is when two bones come together, or two or more bones come together. We also refer to this as a joint, right? So your knee, your elbow, and your fingers, your toes, there's lots of joints, and that's where articulation takes place. Now, at a joint, you have special connective tissue that holds those bones close together, and those are called ligaments. So if you hear about an athlete tearing a ligament, what they've torn is connective tissue that actually attaches bone to bone. Now, if we look at a long bone, like this femur here, this is your thigh bone, right, the upper leg. Long bones are the ones that sort of look like dog bones, right? You don't really have any bones that look exactly like this, but this concept is sort of from the long bones. Now, when you look at a long bone, the long thin part is referred to as the diaphysis, or shaft of the bone, while the end parts are referred to as the epiphyses, or each end is called an epiphysis, or head. So you can say shaft and head, or you can be technical and say diaphysis and epiphysis. Now, at each epiphysis, at each head, you have a couple of projections called condyles. And so these condyles come off of there, and pretty much any kind of long bone has a couple of condyles at each head, but they can be shaped differently, as you can see here from this femur. Kind of here's one condyle. Let me change my color. Here's one condyle, here's another one, but these two projections there. If there is an even further projection, we call that an epicondyle. Now, not every part of every bone has an epicondyle. If you look at this femur, you'll notice here at this end there's sort of this pointy part that sticks out a little bit more. That's the medial epicondyle of the femur. Again, not all bones are going to have epicondyles that go out there. And then there's my favorite word, maybe of all, in skeletal structure, which is tuberosity. Tuberosity is a little notch that kind of sticks out of a bone. And those notches are generally where a muscle will attach via a tendon, or maybe where a ligament holds on to keep a couple bones together. Now, when you look at the skeleton, it really has two sections to it, or two parts. You have an axial skeleton, which makes up the axis of the body. This axial skeleton would be the skull, the vertebral column, the sternum or breastbone, and the ribs. Then you have your appendicular skeleton, your appendages, and these would include the anterior pectoral girdle, which is like the shoulder and arm, the posterior pelvic girdle, which is like your hips, and leg. All right, so we look at it kind of in two groupings. So if we start with the axial skeleton, we'll begin with the skull, or referred to as the cranium. Now, you do not need to know all these different labels in these pictures that I have on here, so I've circled the things that we're really interested in. But notice that the skull is actually shown with the color coding here, a group of bones. And these bones will fuse together during early development to form a solid skull. This is why I'm sure you're all familiar with babies having soft spots or fontanelles on the top of their head. These soft spots are where the bones have not quite fused together yet. And so in that first year of life, generally the skull fuses completely, giving you a solid structure. But it all starts out as separate bones, and you don't have to know these separate bones, but you can look in this picture at all these different colors. There's the frontal bones and the temporal bones and the sphenoid bones and the ethmoid bones and all these different ones that come together to form the skull. Now, there are a couple that I want you to be familiar with. There are a couple features here. One is the mandible, or the lower jaw. And notice that the mandible is actually separate from the rest of the cranium. It is not fused. So this is why you can open and close your mouth, right? The mandible is attached to the skull with ligaments and tendons and muscles. And so a lot of times when you see an underview of the skull, like you see here at the bottom, the mandible is just not there, right? But the mandible will contain the lower dentition, or the lower teeth. The maxilla is the upper jaw, and it, here in this purple color, is fused to the skull. So the upper part of your mouth is fused to the rest of your cranium, and that's where your upper dentition, or your upper teeth, would be. You also have a couple features called the zygomatic arches, which are what basically form your cheekbones. But notice that in this picture, they kind of stick out, right? The zygomatic bone and the zygomatic arch, they form your cheekbone. They help form the orbit where your eye sits. But if we look at it from this underside here, there's actually like a gap there and most people just filled with fat underneath for extra cushioning. And then the only foramen I want you to know, only opening I want you to know is this foramen magnum, which is the very large opening on the bottom side or the underside of the skull. And this is where the spinal cord extends down from your brain and leaves the skull. Now, after the cranium, we have your vertebral column, right? Your vertebrae. And we'll take a look at some of these in class. You can kind of handle them a little bit so you get a better idea of what the shape of and size of these things is. But the vertebrae are a bunch of bones that make up your spinal column. And we have separate little bones so that it gives us a lot more motion in our vertebral column rather than our back being one solid bone. You've got a whole bunch of bones in there so that it can move some. Now, each vertebrae is an interesting shape and has lots of different features that you see in this picture. It has a spinous process, so this is what is kind of oriented toward the back of your body right here. And so if you were to feel kind of down your backbone, you feel bumps, what you're actually feeling are these spinous processes kind of sticking out from the different muscles that are there. Then you also have transverse processes, which if you're really thin, you might also be able to feel along your back. These kind of stick off to the side a little bit, or each side a little bit. Then you have the vertebral foramen, or the vertebral canal, here in the middle. This is where your spinal cord actually is, running through this hole. Then you have transverse foramina, which they're trying to indicate with this sort of circular thing right here. If we were able to turn this picture to the side, you would see that there's also a hole out of either side of this vertebrae. And this is where nerves enter or leave the spinal cord. And then this big part here, which would be more toward the front of your body, is the centrum, or the body of the vertebrae. And this is just a solid structure that you'll kind of be able to see a little better in pictures on these later slides. Now, in between each vertebrae is an intervertebral disc, which is sort of a softer, cushy piece of connective tissue that allows these vertebrae to stack on top of each other, but not rub each other bone on bone, which obviously would not be very comfortable. So here's a picture of the entire vertebral column. Posterior image, so looking at it from the back, and then lateral image looking at it from the side. And you can really see these bodies of the vertebrae nicely in this lateral view. Notice that your spine should be straight when viewed from the front or back. If it's not, that's what scoliosis is, which I'm sure many of you maybe have known people or have yourself had issues with. From the side, however, you should have a curvature to your spine that you see here in order to best support your weight. Now, the vertebrae come in several different groups depending on where they're located. Your first 7 vertebrae are your cervical vertebrae, your neck. And the first 2 are really special. The very first vertebrae is called the atlas, and the second one is called the axis. And this is a little hard to see with a picture and a video here without me showing you in person, but basically these 2 allow for the skull to sit on the vertebral column and then the neck to be turned much farther than the rest of your back. So if you think about that, you can turn your head left and right really far, more so probably than you can twist your whole body left and right. And that's because of this little guy right here. So basically what happens is the skull, this is going to be awful, right? The skull, the skull sits on these little pads right here of the atlas, and then the atlas sits down over this thing called the dens on the axis, and then that allows you to twist this much farther than most of your vertebrae can twist upon each other. Now the second group of vertebrae, the next 12, are referred to as the thoracic vertebrae, T1 through 12. This is where your ribs would articulate, so this is kind of up in your chest region. Then you have a lower group of 5 vertebrae called the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae are really thick and solid, and they're bigger because they bear most of the weight of your upper body. Then you have a structure called the sacrum, which starts out as 5 different sacral vertebrae, but then fuses very early in life to form this one solid mass at the base of your spinal column, which really then becomes also part of your pelvis. And then you have a tiny bone called the coccyx, which is your tailbone in generic terms. For some organisms that have a tail, they then have caudal vertebrae that extend out into their tail. Obviously, we do not have these. We just have a little tailbone. Now, to finish your axial skeleton, we've got your rib cage. So that's going to consist of your sternum or breastbone right in the midline of your chest. And this is sort of your ventral or front anchor for your ribs. At the bottom of that sternum, you have a little extension called the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is commonly broken in a traumatic situation, so a car accident or something where a lot of pressure is put on your chest. Then you have the ribs. And the ribs are long, thin, curved bones that are found in your thorax or your chest area. They articulate in the back, dorsally, with your thoracic vertebrae, and they articulate in the front with that sternum with this costal cartilage that you see here in this kind of whitish gray color in the picture. The ribs don't move much, but when you do inhale and exhale, they can sort of rotate a little bit to open up the rib cage more when you inhale and close down the rib cage more when you exhale. Most important thing here, though, is protection for those lungs and your heart there underneath. So here's a picture of one rib. You can see that curvature. And each rib, kind of like the long bones, has a shaft region and has a head region for articulation. Now, humans have 24 total ribs, 12 pairs. But the ribs are interesting. The first 7, the upper 7, are called true ribs. And the true ribs kind of have their own piece of costal cartilage that connects them to the sternum. Then below those top 7, you have 5 false ribs. And we call them false ribs because they don't directly connect to the sternum. The first 3 of these false ribs connect to the sternum via a conjoined piece of cartilage that you see here in the picture. The last 2 ribs you have are referred to as floating ribs. They actually don't attach in the front. And these are a little uncomfortable if you press on them sometimes, but they're basically just held in place by the musculature of your body. They articulate with the vertebrae in the back, but then they just kind of wrap about halfway around you and stop and are held in place there by the muscles. Now on to the appendicular skeleton, or your appendages. We'll start with the pectoral girdle, right? Pecs, your chest area. This is sort of like the scaffolding on the upper part of your body, the anterior part, where the arms are attached. So what we start with first, though, are your shoulder blades and collarbones. And so shoulder blades are referred to as scapulas. This picture over here is actually a rear image, right? So dorsal image from your back of your right shoulder blade. So if you can kind of picture that, and if you reach over that right shoulder and you kind of feel a ridge back there, what you're feeling is this little ridge here. And then there's a whole bunch of muscle in this area and a whole bunch of muscle in this area. But you can feel that ridge there for most people sticking out back in your shoulder. Now also, if you kind of start in the middle at your collarbone and your neck and you move outward towards your shoulder, when you get to the end of your collarbone, you'll feel a little knob there that's maybe a little bit sensitive, kind of feels funny to touch, and that knob is actually this piece, which is kind of sticking forward. And then your arm bone kind of is right in here in this socket. Now your clavicle is your technical term for your collarbone. You've got one of these on the right and left as well. It has a shape like this, but it's kind of tilted, so you can feel that it kind of has a curve to it if you feel your own collarbone. This is very obvious in a human, but in a smaller animal like the one we'll dissect, it's really hard to find the clavicle. It's very, very much smaller in organisms that walk on 4 legs. Then you have your arm. Right, your upper arm is your humerus, not spelled like something that's funny. Right, it's spelled a little bit differently there. But that's your humerus. Then your forearm, your lower arm, is two bones, the radius and the ulna. There is an interosseous membrane, which is right here, that connects those two forearm bones along their length. But then the way you identify this, and we might look at this more in class together too, is the ulna, I always remembered when I was in school, is sort of underneath. So it's what makes the really pointy part of your elbow, and then it runs kind of on the underside of your forearm. The radius is then the upper part of your forearm. And the reason we call it the radius is because the radius can actually rotate around the ulna at the elbow, which is what allows you essentially to turn your hand over, if you think about that. So the radius and ulna are set at your wrist, but the radius can rotate around the ulna back at your elbow, which is what allows you to turn your hand over. Now then we get to the hand, and I'm not worried about you knowing all these details. There are tons of bones in the hand, and they have lots of different names. I'm not too worried about all those separate ones. I just want you to know that you've got 7 bones in your wrist, which are called carpals. You've got 5 then metacarpals, which basically kind of make up the flat part of your hand. And then you've got phalanges, which are all made of multiple bones, and those are your fingers. So you've got 3 more bones in each finger, 2 more bones in your thumb. And so your digits are your phalanges. Now to the pelvic appendicular skeleton. So you also have a pelvic girdle, your pelvis. The pelvis is really 2 big bones which fuse together along with the sacrum, or that very base part, here I'm circling in red, of your vertebral column to form your pelvis. Now the 2 big bones are called, another one of my favorite words in skeletal anatomy, the innominates. But the innominates themselves actually start as 3 different bones that fuse together on each side. So you have the ilium, which forms kind of this big horn piece, which is anterior and dorsal in the body. We'll do these anatomical terms, or we'll review these anatomical terms later. You also have the ischium, which is kind of posterior and dorsal. Right, it kind of forms this bottom back side of it. And then you have the pubic bone, or pubis, which forms kind of the inside front part. So again, all 3 of these fuse together very early on, and then each side fuses together along with the sacrum in the middle. And the last thing here too is you see these little spots right here. This is another of my favorite words, and we'll cover this later. It's called the acetabulum, and this is where your leg fits in. Right, so your femur, or your leg bone, fits right into that little crevice right there. Speaking of those leg bones, right, the upper leg or thigh is referred to as the femur. It's one of the largest bones that you've got. Then you have a very small kneecap called the patella. This bone is actually quite small. It's just encased with muscle and tendon and ligament and stuff that makes it seem a little bigger from the outside of your body. And then you have the lower leg, which is also kind of like your arm, made of 2 bones, the tibia and the fibula. So make sure to differentiate there. There's no such thing as a tibula or a fibia. It's tibia and fibula. The tibia is the much larger bone of the lower leg. It's the one that makes your shin. So if you feel your shin right there just under your skin, that's the tibia. Then the fibula is a thinner bone that's sort of like encased in your calf muscle. So it's hard to feel the fibula except at the very top and the very bottom of that lower leg. If you feel like that outer ball at your ankle, that's the fibula. Or on the kind of the outer or lower part of your knee, you probably feel a little knob, and that's the head of your fibula. But the main thing you feel in that lower leg is the tibia. These are also connected by an interosseous membrane, and these have a lot of nerves on them, so that's why it hurts so bad if you get kicked in the shin, because you got nerves right there at the surface of that tibia. Okay, and the last thing is the foot, which is a lot like the hand. We just use slightly different terms for parts of it. So again, you've got 7 ankle bones. These are referred to as tarsals. I do want you to recognize one of these names, and that's the calcaneus. The calcaneus is the very large bone that forms your heel, and allows you to support your weight on 2 feet instead of using all 4. Then you have the 5 kind of foot bones that make up the flat part of your foot, which are the metatarsals. And then again, we use the same term, you have phalanges. So your digits here, or your toes, are again made up of 2 or 3 bones, referred to as phalanges. Okay, so that wraps up the skeleton, and it's a lot to digest at once, but we'll be working with this over the next couple of weeks, and I think some of it will just become kind of second nature to you. Hope you have a good day.